So welcome to Wildlife from the Wildlife Trusts for October, and I'm delighted to be here in Manchester for the Conservative Party Conference in what's likely to be, quite possibly, the last party conference ahead of the next general election. And what we wanted to do tonight is discuss the key question about a manifesto pledge that the Conservative Party made at the last general election in 2019, where in their manifesto they pledged to deliver, and I quote, the most ambitious environmental programme of any country on earth. We want to discuss tonight whether that's actually taking place or not, how it's going, and just get a real sense across all the climate and nature issues about the progress that's being made or not being made, or perhaps going backwards. And we have a brilliant panel to help us have this conversation. I'm delighted that we have Rebecca Powell. I think first and foremost, we should say a long-term supporter of the Wildlife Trusts, not least Somerset Wildlife Trust. I think that comes before everything else.
Trustee for 10 years.
Trustee for 10 years.
Very proud.
Absolutely. So Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us as well. Of course, also MP for Taunton Deane and critically, Parliamentary Under Secretary of State at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Rebecca, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We also have James Murray, Editor-in-Chief at BusinessGreen and co-founder of the Net Zero Festival. We have Vicki Hird, who's Strategic Lead on Agriculture at the Wildlife Trusts, and also Ben Goldsmith, Chair of the Conservative Environment Network. Panel, thank you very much for joining us. Please give them a round of applause. So I'll start with the first question to each of you in turn, and just please answer in 2-3 minutes to kick us off. The key question is, are the Conservative Party on track to deliver their manifesto promise of leaving, quote, the most ambitious environmental programme of any country on earth? Rebecca.
How did I know you were going to come to me first, Craig? Well, yeah, that was in our manifesto. As you know, one of the reasons I came to Parliament was to work on environmental issues. I felt that no other party was actually dealing with this, not in the way I felt it needed to be dealt with. And, you know, I referenced a lot of that work I did do with the Wildlife Trusts, in fact, which was really informative. And I'm proud that we now have a raft of legislation in place to deliver what we need to deliver for nature and the environment. And I make absolutely no bones about the fact that we have to do so. You know, it's not solved. There are many reasons why our nature is depleted, not least, you know, our agricultural systems, and actually being part of the CAP was not helpful for nature. We're now free of that. So what I would say is we've got the legislation in place. That was what was so clear from the outside when I wasn't a member of Parliament, was that you do have to get your policies right, and then you have to get your legislation right, and you have to. So we've got our Agricultural Act, Fisheries Act, and Environment Act, and the Environment Act itself, which I was hugely proud to take through the common stages in Parliament, really is a game changer internationally. Whatever people think, I now go out quite a lot on the international stage, and they revere the fact that we managed to get this piece of legislation through Parliament, and it sets a whole raft of the targets that we need to have in place to drive the actions that we want. Not least is the one to restore nature and turn the tide by 2030, and we had to actually fight to get that in there, and we have. So I first and foremost I want to say that, and secondly, because you asked us to be quite quick, we have also completely changed our payments to the agricultural industry, so that we've completely transitioned, so they don't get money just for the privilege of owning land. And I come from a farming family. I grew up in Somerset on a farm and worked there. They have to deliver something for it. And now we're rolling that out. We've got our Sustainable Farming Initiative that's opened now, and we need to get people in on it, and we need them to sign up to restore our hedges, to help us get otters back in my beautiful River Tone, to get more butterflies and more river corridors. And there are other ways to do it on bigger landscape schemes that I know the Wildlife Trust is hugely involved with, but we do need to get our agricultural community in and work with them to produce food productively, but to integrate nature. I'll leave it there, Craig.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. James Murray, editor at BusinessGreen. How are the Conservative Party doing on delivering their manifesto promise of the most ambitious environmental programme of any country on earth?
So, thank you. I was thinking about this when I was coming in today, and it depends on the semantics, doesn't it, of the question. So is it the most ambitious environmental programme of any country in the world? You could argue it is definitely one of the most ambitious programmes. Like, there's some really, really good stuff in there. There's some really ambitious targets on climate change, on nature protection. There's some really exciting policies. I think that the reforms that Rebecca just mentioned on farming subsidies in particular could be world leading. There's some really exciting stuff going on in the renewable space with offshore wind, etc. There's huge plans for industrial decarbonisation. So there's lots of stuff in there that you could position as among the most ambitious environmental programmes in the world. Whether it's the most is a question Ben will know more than I about some of the projects around the world, countries like Costa Rica doing some incredible stuff. Rishi Sunak keeps saying that the UK's led the world on decarbonisation. That's true since 1990. It's not true since 2015. Germany is now ahead of us on that front and has made more progress in recent years. So the question of where we sit in the league table is up for debate on the programme. The big issue, though, is delivery. And you could, if you take the semantics of that to mean, is the government delivering on its pledge to have the most ambitious programme, as in terms of has it actually delivered on a lot of this stuff, I think there's lots and lots of evidence that it's struggling on that front. And, you know, we've seen the Climate Change Committee, we've seen the new environmental regulatory bodies, we've seen literally countless reports. I mean, we literally report on them every single week from BusinessGreen, of business groups or MPs committees or other independent experts just, you know, palpably frustrated that some of these good policies aren't getting advanced as quickly as they'd like to see. And then, of course, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen really vocal attacks on this entire agenda. And those attacks are quite nuanced. You know, the Prime Minister's made absolutely clear he's still committed to reaching net zero targets by 2030, by 2035 and by 2050. He's still talking about the great green industrial revolution opportunity that there is. But he's also, let's be honest, pandering to climate skeptic tropes, you know, talking up the costs of this transition in a way that is undermining investor confidence. And we write for businesses, and I don't think I've ever seen business groups so angry in 20 years of covering this sector, with the mixed signals that they're getting and the lack of confidence that they now have that this actually really impressive programme is going to be delivered in the way that was promised at that election and at previous elections.
Thank you, James. Ben Goldsmith, as chair of the Conservative Environment Network, are the Conservative Party on track to deliver their manifesto promise of the most ambitious environmental programme of any country on earth?
It's getting easier to forget some of the wins that we've secured in the last 5 or 7 years. I had a conversation earlier on with someone from the RSPB, and what we discussed was, if you could have gone back 8 years in time and shown us then the things that would have been done in the last 4 or 5 years, particularly on nature, we wouldn't have believed that such a thing could have happened. The reform of agricultural subsidies along the lines that's been enshrined in the Agriculture Act really might have been my greatest possible ask politically for nature, to link farm subsidies to stewardship and restoration of nature. That's a massive, globally important win. And if we get it right, it becomes something that can be copied elsewhere in the world. Similarly, 25-year environment plan, which was begun under Michael Gove, and Rebecca played a big role. It's a phenomenal document, that lays down some really, really important targets and goals. And the Environment Act, whilst not perfect, is a pretty damn good document. I mean, it runs to 400 or 500 pages, and it's full of all kinds of brilliant targets and so on, which ratchet over time. And there's now an Office for Environmental Protection, which is kind of the enforcer. That's not going anywhere. So there's a bunch of stuff that is happening that was really beyond the wildest dreams of my 30-year-old self, 10 years ago. That being said, it seems to me a little bit like the Conservative Party actively doesn't want to take credit for these things, because the environmental record is not that bad. I mean, these legal frameworks are unbelievably good, and delivery of these things are always going to be difficult, and implementation is now the big challenge. Can it be implemented without wobbles and without backtracking? I don't know, but the record is there to be grabbed, and they should be trumpeting it from the rooftops. And I think what worries me more than the substance of recent rhetoric, I don't think any of the changes that seem to me to be particularly concrete. What worries me is the narrative. It's this idea that actually, we can question the pan-societal consensus around the need to restore nature and the need to aim for net zero as quickly as we can. That consensus is fragile, and it's been achieved by a lot of work by people from all parts of the political spectrum, and I think you can destroy it very easily by pandering to the kind of tropes that James mentioned. So I'm unhappy with the rhetoric of the last kind of year or two, and I've been upset by that. That being said, it is easy to forget some of the big moves that have been taken, and I think they're quite robust. Now, a lot of the things we're most excited about are somewhat inexorable. There may be wobbles on the way, it may take longer than we thought, but it's sort of happening. Greatest of any country on earth? I'm not sure I know enough about other. I think the environmental land management scheme is globally important. Let's say that.
In which case, perfect to move to Vicki to find out how that in particular is going. And Vicki, what's your perspective? Is this party on track to deliver that manifesto promise?
Well, I'm going to be blunt because your question is whether we're on track, and the answer is no. Definitely not. But I do recognise what the other panellists have said, that there have been some really important moves, and I do understand and I do agree that the Agriculture Act and the move to pay farmers for public goods absolutely was what we were all calling for, and it's what Michael Gove set out in his Health and Harmony consultation, and we all supported that. But we're here 6 years later. I can't imagine how many hours of meetings later. And Martin is sitting here from Nature Friendly Farmers Network, the NFU. Lots of conservation experts have been sitting in meetings for a long time to come up with what were fantastic ideas, great concepts for environmental schemes for farmers, which would give them a pathway to really become truly sustainable, resilient, regenerative farmers. That's what we need, all farmers. I totally agree, we need them to start on the first ladder. And some of them are really reluctant, and we don't have the advisory setup that's affordable, particularly in England, to help them to make that transition. So we've got a lot of farmers that we really need to do that on 70% of the land in the UK which is farmed. And 70% of the land in the UK is farmed, so it's absolutely critical to get that right, not only for nature and wildlife, but for our climate change objectives, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. So nobody's mentioned the Climate Change Act in this conversation so far. That's absolutely critical. But we've got all those meetings and a huge amount of effort, brilliant Defra staff working on the detail. But what's come out is incredibly weak shadow of what we were envisaging. There's no ambition for farmers to go further within each scheme. They can pick and mix, pick and choose what they want. And we know pick and mix kind of approaches haven't worked in the past to deliver the kind of whole farm, nature in-field and around the field kind of outcomes that we know we need for the connectivity, for the defragmentation of habitats that our wildlife absolutely critically needs. So the current SFI, which is Sustainable Farming Incentive, is a bit of a very weak shadow of what we were all envisaging was going to come out of Michael Gove's great idea. I hope that it moves on and that it becomes much more ambitious and it helps farmers go on the transition. That's what we've got to see. So I would say we're not on track because that's not there. But I will be reasonable in saying I'm hoping that's coming. And obviously there's other schemes like the landscape recovery, which is actually going very well. Landscape recovery scheme is for large-scale recovery of critical habitats like forests, which would be great, rainforests, temperate rainforests, but also peatlands and woodlands. And that is going well, so credit to them there. But on pesticides, on water, on climate, really we're not there.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's take the first question from the audience. James, right down the front, if we can, Joe, down here. And show me your hand if you might want to ask the next phase as well. James, please introduce yourself as well.
Thanks, Craig. James Wallace, Chief Executive of River Action. I had the pleasure of working with you, Rebecca, and Lord Goldsmith on putting together the River Buffer Scheme. It was the Woodlands for Water Scheme, which resulted in about £15 million commitment for a trial with various NGOs. But it hasn't scaled, and really my question's about that. I now run an organisation called River Action, and we're obviously concerned about wildlife and river quality. Every single river in our country is chemically polluted and only 14% are in good ecological condition. So, as I think has already been reflected in the panel, we're having a lot of promises and plans that I would agree are promising. However, when it comes to delivery, so I was at the Lib Dem conference last week, and they committed to an extra $1 billion in ELMS to help for these sorts of payments to incentivise farmers. I think it should be a lot more than that. What do you think we might be able to see pertaining particularly to rivers and wildlife associated with rivers in your manifesto?
Thank you for that. Yes, and you're doing some good work on that scheme. But actually, we are bringing in some of those ideas into what farmers can apply for. The idea of river corridors and river buffers is one of the key things that we're trying to get farmers to sign up for. And very much that aligns with our plan for water, which I'm sure you've read. And within that, a lot of commitments as to how we are going to work, especially on a move towards a catchment scale of management. So a lot of the projects that are underway will be aligning with that. And that's very much got water at its heart, cleaning up our water, delivering what we need for our water in terms of both quality, but also supply. So chalk streams would be a really big example of just how much work we are doing. And I personally have absolutely prioritised chalk streams. We've got basically about 90% of the world's chalk rivers and chalk streams are in this country. They are just the most amazingly iconic habitat. But we're already funding a whole range of projects on chalk rivers and chalk streams. I've been visiting some this summer where we're re-meandering the rivers and putting back the old pathway of the river, because back in Victorian days all we wanted to do was straighten rivers, to run the water through our mills and create energy and the things that were required then. But now we understand we want to put them back on their old watercourses because that slows the flow. And there's an amazing natural restoration that then occurs on the riverbanks. So we've prioritised things like that in our plan for water. So far from not doing enough, I think we're absolutely escalating it and getting more protection for these areas. And I think putting that very much at the heart of what we're doing in our plan for water. But it is actually linking it all up with what the farmers do, and it's all very well, I think, to sort of say the schemes aren't getting off the ground and they're not ambitious enough. But farmers, they have to volunteer for these things. We're not China. We can't make them do it. So we've got to hook them in.
Would you mind if I just clarify that? I appreciate what you're saying, and it's really that it's the amount of money that's not there. That it was very promising a few years ago with the Environment Act, and I do support most of it. It's just where's the money going to come from?
It's an interesting point what you say, but of course, the money is guaranteed. The money that was came from the CAP, the equivalent amount has been guaranteed by Treasury. But we need people to actually apply for the schemes to get it.
But can I just say, they are applying. Those trying to do countryside stewardship at higher tier level, they're getting turned away because money isn't there. I mean, we absolutely hear that in the trusts and NHF Farmers Network. They're getting turned away right now.
Well, I find that I don't know. I find that hard to believe because we've got 30,000 contracts signed, and the number of people going into the higher level of stewardship is absolutely rocketed. And that's what we wanted, because that's a sort of precursor, really, because then they can transition over, because those are the farmers who are genuinely engaged. But also, we've got so many farmers and groups going into clusters to work together on things like river catchments. So it's all very well for the Liberal Democrats just saying to put in another billion. Where's that coming from? And as far as I'm concerned, I mean, the Liberal Democrats have no plan. I never hear them talking about nature in Parliament. I mean, where's the money coming from? And B, how they're going to get it out the door. We've already guaranteed the money. We need the farmers to access it. And I'm glad you mentioned the landscape recovery schemes, because we've realised how well they're working. So the next tranche is now open. And those are the ones that we're absolutely tailoring to deliver the things we need in particular. So there'll be a real focus on, for example, river restoration in those, or tree planting, to get big schemes off the ground, which I think really do make a big difference, don't they, to our landscape and our nature recovery. And the Wildlife Trusts are involved in lots of them.
Absolutely.
Not least in Somerset.
Yes, absolutely. I just want to come back to the point about sort of rules and regulations. So I don't think anyone in this room would defend the Common Agricultural Policy, but actually what it did have is it had some rules in it around cross-compliance. So actually it said that if farmers are going to receive a certain amount of money, here's some regulations, not least in relation to watercourses, that have to be followed if they're going to get that money. Cross-compliance ends next year. What will the government do there? You know, it's offering carrots in terms of these payments around farming with water. Will it also offer sticks?
But we are contrary to, I think, what you said, we have got more farm inspectors now. We've got far more catchment-sensitive advisors. We've got more EA inspectors. You know, more money's been put into all these things. And actually, farmers, the ones I meet, they're crying out for people to turn up on their door and help them decide what scheme to go for. And so forth. So, but also, you must remember that the farming community themselves were utterly fed up with all of that cross-compliance, and a lot of it was a lot of time wasting, a lot of form filling out, and it was pretty draconian. So I think we have to have an amount of trust here as well. But we do need to know that the taxpayers' money is going to deliver what we need. So I do agree with that. That's
but if a
that's
farmer,
really important.
If a farmer doesn't sign up for sustainable farming incentive or any of the other environmental land management schemes, what powers will you have to make sure watercourses don't end up polluted?
Well, you know, you've got protections for trees and hedgerows and stuff. But again, you can't force farmers to do it. You have to entice them in to encourage them. And a great many of them are doing this, particularly in groups, working together. Many of them working with NGOs like yourself.
Let me put a follow-up question to you, Ben, if I can, because on this issue about budget, and you said, Rebecca, that the government promised to maintain the budget that was there in the Common Agricultural Policy, but to roll it over into the new schemes. And originally, when it was introduced, Ben, Michael Gove talked about splitting it 3 ways between the lower tier, the middle tier, and what you would call, I think, the rewilding tier, the more ambitious one. And then the government moved away from that commitment last year. And yet it is the more ambitious tiers that are actually the ones that are oversubscribed at the moment. I mean, how do you feel in terms of whether it's delivering that ambition or not?
I remember originally when I was still on the board of Defra, the National Farmers Union were of the view that the landscape recovery, or what I would call the rewilding end of the scheme, would be undersubscribed. No one would want to do it. Farmers want to prioritise food production, and the money needs to go into the pillar that rewards better farming rather than more dramatic changes to the landscape. They were wrong. It was massively oversubscribed, as Rebecca said, and the first 22 projects are remarkable. And I think, again, this year, word is that the quality of the projects has increased, the quantity has increased. And so there's a very powerful argument, given that this is so obviously demand-driven now. There's a very obvious argument for expanding landscape recovery. And I think there's also a point about the progressive nature of that end of the scheme, because landscape recovery tends to be centred in farm clusters in places where the land is not very agriculturally productive. You know, it's not typically the grade 1, grade 2 arable land that's interested in landscape recovery. It's places where producing food in an intensive way is not really viable. You know, it's in our national park landscapes and our former wetlands and so on. So those farmers who are least able to turn a profit growing food and least able to make much of a dent in our national food production, those are the ones that stand to benefit most from the more ambitious ends of the scheme. So they really should be increasing, I think, the whole budget, and they should emphasize the increase on those 2 more ambitious ends of it. I do accept the argument that we need to get as many farmers as possible to sign up into SFI at the beginning, but it's vital that then the thing gets ratcheted and becomes more and more ambitious over time. Otherwise, the whole exercise starts to look a little pointless. I just want to make a more general point, though, if I may. Rebecca, my brother Zach, to some extent Michael Gove, you know, John Randall, who's now in the House of Lords, these are really rare beings, members of Parliament who deeply love nature. You know, there aren't as many as we'd all think in any part of the House, wherever you are on the political spectrum. I know lots of them, and you know, the vast majority don't have the kind of connection with nature that your average Wildlife Trust member does. They don't really get that this is more important than, say, stamp collecting or some other kind of hobby. You know, they don't fully understand the practical importance of nature to everything that we have and everything that we do, and they don't share that kind of visceral connection that is there, if a little dormant, within all people. And I think that therein lies the main problem, because people like Rebecca, you know, they defend government policy on the stage. Behind the scenes, they hammer very hard for increased budgets and for more ambitious timelines and for tougher regulations and for all these things. And so sometimes they get lucky and things happen. The Species Reintroductions Task Force is a thing that's been slightly lost within the small print of current government affairs, but it's something that appeared because of the energy of certain people, certain people in government.
Chalk streams would be a good example
Chalk
of that.
streams being another one. Rebecca's gone on and on. So what we really need is we need more people of the kind you find in the average wildlife trust team and membership to get into politics. And we need a much greater emphasis on connecting people with nature from childhood upwards, because it's the political environment stems from that and nothing else. People just don't get it.
So Ben, on that, I mean, just in the last, and we're going to come to James here, because just in the last couple of weeks, of course, just as when you're saying we need more people to get into politics, actually we've had this weekend Richard Walker, famously managing director of chair of Iceland, leave the Conservative Party because he's so cross about what's been happening the last couple of weeks. Just this week you've had business leaders that said to vote Conservative at the last election have now come out and said otherwise. James, it feels the mood is turning, certainly in business.
I think there's absolutely a lot of evidence for that. There's immense frustration. I mean, I'm always very wary of anyone who speaks for the business community, because there is no such thing. I mean, there is a very, very broad spectrum of views, and all of these policies that we've seen announced in recent times, you could find somebody from the business community that would support them. Often maybe from a polluting organisation that would support some of the moves we've seen in recent times, and others who would say that isn't, that's destroying my market. I want more regulation, I want more policy, I want more incentive, or whatever it may be, to help drive that investment. The one thing that most businesses, though, do share is a desire for greater certainty and greater clarity. And the problem in the last few months in particular, but also just the general chaos that we've seen of the last 2 years with however many, 4 prime ministers, 3, one, significant number, is that businesses just aren't getting that certainty and are struggling to make those investments. And Chris Stark was saying last week, the chair of the Climate Change Committee, the thing about climate change is this is a capital problem, this is an investment problem, a finance problem. It's all about big upfront investments to get good long-term returns. And if you throw instability and policy uncertainty into that mix, you do push up the price of capital, and therefore you drive up the cost of these projects, even at a time when it's becoming more evident that the renewables technologies work, the electric vehicles technologies work, and all the nature projects work in terms of climate resilience and other returns. The business case of them is getting stronger and stronger, and yet the policy uncertainty and political climate is still pushing up the price of capital for them. And I just wanted to come to the question about the rivers as well, and the need for more money. Everything in this agenda needs more money. The climate crisis is so severe and the impacts are going to be so severe that we are going to have to get used to spending a lot more money to bolster our resilience in the face of, we can argue over whether they're existential or not, but massive, massive threats on everything. National security, local security, local impacts, energy bills, all this stuff is interconnected. It's hugely complicated. We need more money. And the challenge for any government, and whoever is in government after the next parliament, is all about the choices we make as to how we fund it. So just today, the water companies have come forward with their plans for how they want to deliver more investment to tackle some of these problems. It's 150 quid more on people's bills. Now, I don't think Rishi Sunak, and probably not Keir Starmer either, are going to go into the election with a message going, we're going to put 150 quid on your water bills. But equally, we haven't built a reservoir in this country since the early 90s. And we've got drought conditions that are getting worse all the time. So someone's got to pay. Someone's got to make the political leadership that will make the case that without this investment, we are in a world of trouble. And we're just not seeing that, arguably not seeing it across the entire political climate, but we're particularly not seeing it from the government at this current moment.
Okay, I will come back to the panel, but I want to go out to the audience for another question, and I've got questions that came in advance as well. Yes, lady in the second row. Third, sorry.
James, thank you very much for raising the question of investment. My name is Julia Davis. I'm a founding member of Patriotic Millionaires UK, and we are quite vocal about the subject of the need for investment in all of these matters. So it's not just from an environmental perspective, absolutely everything requires investment, and to the extent we're not making that investment, we're leaving it to our kids and our grandchildren to make that investment. So Rebecca, you said where can the money come from to fund all of these projects? Well, I've just got one figure in front of me now. If we equalised capital gains tax, so that's tax on capital, on wealth, with tax on people going out to work, I've got a figure here of 90 billion that could be raised. So that's a lot of money to go towards the wildlife agenda that we're talking about today. It's a lot of money to go towards investing in renewables. It's also a lot of money to go towards us gearing up for the fact that we've got an ageing population. So all of these things that we have got to deal with are really a matter of, I would say, are we going to invest in it now and reduce the cost for future generations, or are we just leaving it to them? So if we don't invest now, we're not just leaving them to pick up the ticket of doing the investment we should have done now. We're leaving them to deal with greater costs. So sorry, that's a response. It's not a question. My question is, if we're going to look after our wildlife, we can do all of these things. We can address, we can look after our rivers, we can look after our hedgerows, etc. But if we don't address dangerous climate change, we're very much just trying to, run up a downward escalator. And this government has just announced hundreds of new oil and gas licenses in direct contravention of what it's being advised by its own advisors, by all international bodies. Another announcement this week on Rosebank. So, Rebecca, I'm looking at you in particular. How can that be justified? Please explain to me how that is in any way consistent with tackling dangerous climate change and protecting our wildlife.
Yes, well, I agree with you. Climate change is absolutely critical. It's been totally recognised. That's why we've got net zero legislation. Yes, Rishi's announced a slowdown in some of the direction of travel for getting there, but the direction of travel is still there, and it will speed up, as we know, because technology is changing all the time. Costs are coming down, just as happened with the solar industry. We subsidised that to start with. It got going, the price of the panels came down, the subsidy was removed. And remember the huge criticism that was raised when that happened. And of course, that's helped that industry to completely get going. Similarly with the wind industry. But I will just, and I'm a strident, ardent environmentalist, so I have to go out there, as Ben says, and I do battle to stand up for these things. But equally, when you're in government, you always have to remember that you and I and the ordinary person, the people I meet out when I'm on the doors in Taunton Dean, and how these things just affect their pocket and their day-to-day life. So every single thing we do, every single policy has to be analysed like that. And then you have to say, can people withstand this right now? How could we help them if they can't manage an increase in a bill? And the whole situation about the reservoirs, it's very well to say we haven't built a reservoir for all that time. Look at the massive opposition that we have every time we propose a reservoir. I've had it from the Liberal Democrats, actually, on that Abington reservoir. 2 debates, on people not wanting the reservoir. And yet we know we've got to increase our water supplies so that there's in these water plans, there are a lot of proposals for increasing our water infrastructure. And you're right, it does have to be paid for. And that's why, for example, just with water companies, we do have to make sure that they can attract investment because they've got so much to invest. So we have to make sure that will work because that money just, whatever you quote, that just cannot all come from the taxpayer. Because if we left everything in the environment to coming out of the taxpayer's pocket, we'd be fighting in government for against hospitals, education, environment. And although I might put the environment at the top, not everybody will. So it's still balance. And I'm not disagreeing with what you say at all. You've obviously got some really, really good information. But none of it is simple. But and I personally do think it's absolutely the overarching most critical thing is to get these things right. But the oil and gas, just very quickly, and I do understand, and even the Climate Change Committee said this, there has to be a transition period. You just can't suddenly switch from one to the other. There has to be a period where we will need some of these conventional fuels. And also, I think it's really important to factor in the issue that you don't want to offshore your damage, and bring in oil or gas if you've got to, produce under much worse conditions, causing much more harm to the environment. So
I want to bounce out another issue around here because you said there that it can't just be the taxpayer that pays for these things. we need to attract private sector investment on this as well. But Ben, what's the relationship between the public and private sector investment? You've said on the record over the last couple of weeks that some of the moves recently are deeply unconservative and actually have caused real problems in terms of attracting that. There's a relationship between the public sector investment and private sector investment.
Yeah, so I think first and foremost there's a prioritisation issue when it comes to spending the government's money, or taxpayers' money. I mean, I read in the BBC yesterday that since records began 70 years ago, society has never paid more tax than it does currently. So we've got across the board the highest taxes we've ever had, and yet the environment is a rounding error. You know, I was on the board of Defra. You know, the entire budget of Defra, including the Environmental Land Management Scheme, is sort of the amount that the Ministry of Defence and the NHS spend on stationery or something. I mean, it's just minuscule, even though absolutely everything is subsidiary to the natural environment. So I think it's the prioritisation of nature and the environment is a far bigger issue in respect of what we're talking about here than the total quantum of tax that's taken from society. The private sector has a massive role to play. You know, once you start to recognise the inherent price of pollution or the inherent value of a healthy ecosystem and the things it does for us, then people can start to pay for it in a more rational way. So, for example, if you have a business which is polluting the watercourse, you ought to pay for cleaning up the watercourse rather than relying on society to pick up the bill. The polluter pays principle is a very basic tenet of kind of conservative orthodoxy. You know, free and fair markets, you pay your own bill. Similarly, we know, for example, that healthy landscapes act like sponges. We know that if you have ponds and wetlands and re-wiggled streams and lots of scrub, that when it rains, those landscapes hold the water and release it slowly through the year. We know that that's what happens. The value of that is tangible and quantifiable. So water companies and flooding agencies and so on can pay for that if we start to quantify it. So things like the nutrient neutrality rule change that's been proposed really is going away from that idea of the polluter pays towards an idea of the taxpayer paying, which for me is not the direction of travel you'd be going on if you believe in free market kind of orthodoxy.
Okay, thank you, Ben. James, the Labour has said that they want to invest £28 billion of essentially public money in green investment if they come to power. I think Conservative Party has said today they want to do that through private investment. Do you think that's going to be achievable?
Potentially. It depends the policy frameworks and the legislation that you put in place. You know, if we have a high enough carbon price, if we have clean energy contracts that work, then you could mobilise a lot more private sector capital. I mean, you talk to lots of people in the city who are supportive of the green agenda. Their argument is there is a wall of money ready to go if you can just get these clean tech projects to an investable stage, towards final investment decisions. And that's across the piece, you know, whether it's nuclear, whether it's renewables, whether it's energy efficiency, whether it's rewilding. There is a lot of capital out there that wants to be allocated towards this stuff for exactly the reasons they've been so frustrated with the announcement in recent days. They realise this is the future economy, it's the 21st century economy, and it will help them mitigate against climate risks that could be genuinely catastrophic. So there is a kind of private sector-led programme you could put forward that would help accelerate decarbonisation agenda. And in his interviews recently, Rishi Sunak, quite grumpily at times, has sort of hinted at that. He suggested there will be an alternative way of doing this than the programme that he has watered down in some ways. The problem is, where is it? You know, could someone explain it? I mean, Kemi Badenoch gave us an interview with the Sunday Times yesterday going, you know, we want a more pragmatic way of doing net zero. Well, go on then. You know, you've been in power for 13 years. Can we hear what it is? Could you please explain how you're going to do this? Because what we've seen is the target date for phasing out electric internal combustion engines has just been pushed back. The offshore, most significantly, the offshore wind auction just failed. So we have, 10, 11 gigawatts of capacity we were hoping for that now we don't know is coming, and we're going to have to run that again. Energy efficiency rules have just been scrapped for landlords. You know, all this stuff just adds up to a perception that those businesses that want to invest and those individuals who want to invest start to feel like, well, am I going to get a return if I do so? And sorry, just the last big one is we've known for years and years and years, carbon capture and storage. The government's got some really ambitious plans, hydrogen as well. The companies that want to do that, they want to reinvigorate Teesside, they want to reinvigorate areas around here, still waiting on the policy detail and how those projects are going to happen. They just want to get to final investment decisions and make it happen. I appreciate these are difficult decisions, they have cost implications, but we're on the clock to reach those emissions targets. The Prime Minister has said they'll be met. How?
So let's come to a question we got in advance from David Gardner. He asks, when the current government repeatedly reneges on its environmental promises and fails to meet obligations, why should we listen to anything they say or vote for them? And we just put together a few lists of things that the Wildlife Trust were waiting for. Beaver reintroductions, of course, was promised by Boris Johnson in his conference speech in October 21. Ban on horticultural peat use, you knew I'd say that one, Rebecca, promised by the end of this Parliament, and time running out there. The chemical strategy that was promised in the 25-year environment plan published in 2019, but still not, and then recommitted in 2023 in the Environmental Improvement Programme, but still yet to be published. And the National Action Plan on the Sustainable Use of Pesticides, which was promised back in December 2020, but still hasn't arrived. On that last one, Vicki, National Action Plan on Sustainable Use of Pesticides, some people really have been waiting for that for a long time, haven't they?
Yeah, I mean, it was part of, in a way, it came from the Sustainable Use Directive of the European Commission, and obviously we're reinventing it, but it's absolutely critical. I mean, these are polluting our rivers, our soils, and our food, in fact, through residues, and yet farmers... I mean, one of the problems with a lot of this in terms of the farmed land and farmers, it's very hard for them to change what they're doing without the kind of support that we're talking about. And we've identified that we need 4.4 billion just to meet our biodiversity and net zero targets and environmental nature targets. So that's 4.4 billion piece of work by the National Trust, RSPB and Wildlife Trust, and that's not a huge amount of money. But, you know, one of the critical things is to really reduce the need for these pesticides. And, you know, I was just looking at this, the Sustainable Farming Incentive, and you can get £960, I think, for doing a plan. And you don't actually necessarily have to go any further. What would be great is we knew that you did the plan and then you had to do something about it. But that will also require you implementing Clause 29 of the Agriculture Act, which is about fair dealing, making sure the supply chain pays a fair reward for, well, deals properly with farmers and growers so they can actually change what they're doing. They can invest in agro-environmental farming schemes and practices, because it's very difficult when they're getting this pressure squeeze from the market, from the supermarkets, the food service sector, the manufacturers. Cheaper, more uniform, quicker, cheaper, more uniform, quicker, all the time. That's very difficult. And yet on this other side, they're being asked to join these schemes and everything. We've got to get both sides of it right. We've got to give them the money they need, and we've got to give them the protection from abusive practices from the supply chain that they need. And we're still waiting for the Dairy Code of Practice. It's not here. We've been waiting for 2 months, 2 years. So that's another thing. The consultation was in 21. Another thing we're still waiting for.
There are other ones here that I haven't read out. Rebecca, you and I have talked about it a lot in the past. This ban on horticultural peat use that people like me have been waiting for a quarter of a century, and we've been told to date there's not been parliamentary time to deliver it. Are we on the verge of a King's Speech that finds parliamentary time to get rid of nutrient neutrality but doesn't find time to ban horticultural peat use?
Well, I know we've talked about this many times, and I think we've made great strides on what we've done on peat and peatland, so phasing that out for amateur use, which after all is the majority of the peat that's used. Peat is still used in some intensive horticultural industries like mushroom farming, and as you know, we've talked about before. I mean, Defra has put money into researching 100 different types of growing mediums that might be used to replace peat, with some success in some of them. And so there's only very small niche areas still actually using any peats, and you know, but we are doing great work on peatland, re-wetting it, for example, raising the water table. I mean, I do sometimes think it would be good to talk about the massively positive things that have occurred, you know, just in Somerset, in my patch. £750,000 has gone to just 2 different projects to work on raising water tables, but also I visited a great project on the Norfolk Broads in the summer, which was some Defra money was being used to raise the water table, grow reeds under this system called paludiculture, and investigate and research new products that we could make from growing the reeds on the peatland, i.e. not using the peat for anything, but growing, and there's some of them that they were fascinating. The reeds, which are a bit like bulrushes, take the fluffy stuff off the top, and they were using it to insulate coats. And there were some bricks being made out of reeds used in construction. So there is a huge amount of work going on. I wanted to come back to you on your list.
Okay.
You'll be pleased to hear I am working on the chemical strategy. A huge amount of work's gone into that. And I've just come back, actually, from the Intergovernmental International Conference on Chemicals, because a global chemical framework is being worked on right now. Hopefully it will be in the press in the week. The declaration was finally agreed this weekend. And that is a big piece of the jigsaw that is missing. We've got climate change frameworks, we've got biodiversity frameworks, but we do need one on chemicals, because this pollution is the missing piece of the jigsaw. And I think Ben talked about polluter pays and things, which, we have to stick to polluter pays. And that's why our new, for example, waste extended producer responsibility scheme is based on that, putting the onus back on the manufacturers of the packaging to be responsible for its whole life cycle, with a view that they'll make products that are reusable, recyclable, and will last longer, and that will have an impact on our environment. So, far from just being critical about it all, and also the Pesticides Action Plan is underway, and we do have an integrated pest management strand in the SFI, and we are transitioning farmers over to that, with a lot of really, really interesting work going on with many farmers on using biocontrols and different types of crops, so that to combat pests. So there is a big move going that way. And there's just one other thing I wanted to mention. Somebody mentioned about the getting in private funding. I think it was you, wasn't it? This is a really good example. So Syngenta have opened a significant fund for SMEs, because it's often them that have the really brainwaves for the innovations.
The SMEs.
Yeah, the small and medium companies, but they just can't cope with the regulation or the scaling up or that. So this fund is for them to research biocontrols for farmers, and that's the way I think we're going to get a lot more of this private funding in, and we can help these small companies to scale up with their good ideas. That I genuinely think that is one of the roads that we need to go down further.
Thank you very much. Another question from the audience. There's someone been waiting patiently there.
Yeah, sorry, John Loader. I'm like Rebecca. I'm a trustee of the Wildlife Trust, and this time of the Lancashire, Manchester, North Merseyside, which is where we are today. One of the things we've been doing, we've been putting great significance to biodiversity net gain, and put considerable resources to it. But bearing that in mind, I've had to written this down. Bearing in mind you gave us 6 weeks notice of the delay in implementing biodiversity net gain, i.e. you talked about it coming in January. How confident is a panel to say it will be implemented in January, in start of next year, or any time before the next election? Thank
you. Ben, you picked up your microphone.
Only because I asked this exact question.
Right.
Well, a friend of mine is now working as environmental advisor in Number 10, who used to be in Defra, and before that was in our Conservative Environment Network. She's definitely an ally, and she has assured me 100% cast iron that biodiversity net gain is safe and is going to happen according to the timetable they've announced, and also that the environmental land management scheme is safe, and will get better and better, and I trust her. So I believe biodiversity net gain is safe, and I think it's a pretty good thing.
James, you've written on BusinessGreen a fair bit about this.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the announcement came. When the announcement came out, I think it was an interesting 24 hours. So the BBC report came out saying that it had been delayed, and there were some furious responses from the Green Building Council in particular. Again, a business group that wants this regulation to happen, that represents a lot of big builders. And there was yet another very, very angry statement. And luckily, within, I think it was about 6 hours, I think Defra put out the confirmation that the delay was only going to be 2 months. So, I mean, hopefully it can all be taken at its word and it's coming into place in January. And again, I think this is one of those areas that is really, really positive. I think there was a study that was done that, I can't remember the exact figure, but it was tens of thousands of football pitches worth of land could be funded for better protection for biodiversity and creating new habitats. It's quite a transformational policy along with the farming subsidy reform. And I think one of the frustrations for people I know who are, you know, on the centre-right or on the right of politics is that there is some good stuff going on, and there does seem a reluctance in the right-wing press and parts of the Conservative Party to really talk about it and celebrate it. And hopefully this will be a nice legacy issue for this Parliament if it does indeed come in as planned.
So we're in the last 5 minutes now. I want to come to all the panel with a final question, if I can. And this is in the context where Rebecca and Ben, I'll give you a little bit of a pass here. We know you believe this stuff and you're doing things, Rebecca inside government, Ben in terms of running the Conservative Environment Network. The thing I really want to get to, we all know that there's a very live debate in the Conservative Party at the moment around whether there's electoral gain to be made from pushing back on this agenda or not. You know, let's just explore that. You know, why is this debate happening in the Conservative Party at the moment? Why is it that there's many MPs, you know, crawling around Liz Truss or whatever, talking about cutting back on net zero and environmental protections and so on? And the big question is, will it work? Do you think it would work electorally? Will it work politically? Ben, I'll kick you off with that first, then I'll come to these and come finish with you, Rebecca.
I mean, I think Australia provides a really good template. You know, the Liberal Party of Australia, which is their Conservatives, got absolutely trounced in the last election, partly because of a whole slew of independents who were focused on climate and environment, called the Teals. And I think what that shows is that in developed nations like ours, we're quite similar to Australia, you know, people care about this stuff in a way that perhaps they haven't in such numbers previously. You know, it seems to me that young, old, rich, poor, left-leaning, right-leaning, urban, rural, people really do demand now the recovery of nature. They really want action on climate. They're frightened of some of the threats that climate change poses. And so I think it's not a smart political strategy, I think, to water down or backtrack this stuff. You know, I think it just from a pure strategic perspective, it doesn't make sense. I think the generous interpretation is that our Prime Minister is someone who's conscientious, who is a details person, and who has pored over the detail and decided that actually we're going too fast in some areas. Now, I disagree with that. I think it's created some uncertainty in a bunch of different areas of potential investment. So I'm not a fan of some of the announcements that have been made. But I think that's one of the interpretations. The other is that he's speaking to a small segment of the audience, the sort of GB News audience, who are in many cases consumed by conspiracy theory, and I think feeding that is a terrible, terrible mistake, because the consensus that we have in society around nature and climate is fragile, and it can be broken easily. And so I hope that we've seen all of it. I hope we're going to get a great nature speech from the Prime Minister soon. I'm told we are. And I hope that it's all plain sailing from here. We shall see.
Vicki Hird, do you think it will work electorally?
I agree with Ben that I think people are absolutely getting more excited about nature and climate change, particularly young folk. You know, you had a lot of young people at the Wildlife Trust's annual conference, and they were absolutely clear this was top of the agenda, because it's their future, their home, our home, and it's absolutely, you know, the State of Nature report, which came out last week, you know, it was the fourth time that report has been done. It's showing we're still going downwards. And that got a lot of coverage, got a lot of interest. And I do talks around the country about invertebrates as my love. And I can see people in the room utterly terrified about the fact they're not seeing dead you know, insects on the windscreen, you know, like we used to. That's the elder generation. The younger people don't know what we're talking about when you say we used to see insects on our windscreen, you know, and then they get it and they realise we've lost so much. And I think Ben's absolutely right. It's just got so much higher above other things on the agenda, because this is our home. And we all need to protect our home and make sure it can work in the future for future generations. So I think it would be a really, really big mistake if any party chooses to use that as a point of difference and an electoral issue. It's just not. It's our home.
James, never mind the climate and nature crisis and all that. Is Rishi being a political genius?
I think we could do with some, couldn't we? It's, I think making predictions about politics since 2016 has proven to be a mug's game for a lot of people. There is a very, very volatile political landscape. There are a lot more kind of switching voters, a lot more disengaged voters who are just so fed up with the chaos of the last few years they've checked out. And we are dealing with a long-running economic crisis where real wages haven't risen in the best part of 15 years now. So there is, unfortunately, there is fertile ground for divisive and weaponised politics. And that, I think, is probably the best explanation of why this route is being pursued, that it is the last best hope of closing what looks like a very persistent 20-point poll lead. And there is a degree of desperation around that within Number 10, and that's what they're throwing things at the wall and seeing if this will stick. It shouldn't work. I mean, all the polling suggests that it probably won't work. And I do find it utterly bizarre that the Conservative Party seems completely relaxed about, or certainly members of the Conservative Party, not all of them, but members of the Conservative Party, influential members of the Conservative Party, very, very relaxed about the fact that virtually no one under 50, or very, very low percentage of people under 50, are interested in voting for the party anymore. And it seems to have lost vast swathes of the business community. I mean, this is not small c conservatism as it used to be. And I'm surprised there is not more visible debate within the party and more pushback at those who seem very, very relaxed at this situation. So it shouldn't work, but the worrying thing, I think, for a lot of people who cover green issues and green politics closely is the only way that it could work is to really go really, really hard on weaponising this stuff, to make people really fearful that net zero is going to push all their bills up by 10, 20%. That clean technologies don't work, that this is some kind of 15-minute city conspiracy agenda. And today we've seen members of the cabinet calling environmental campaigners zealots, talking about 15-minute cities as some kind of sinister plot. That's the actual quote, the word sinister. And lots of people in completely good faith, in business and in the environmental movement are very, very concerned that even if it doesn't work and the Conservatives lose as a result, the genie's being let out of the bottle. And we've seen in America where that type of divisive politics, that misinformation on environmental issues leads, and let's be honest, it is nowhere good.
Rebecca, you were pulling some interesting facial expressions there.
I've forgotten what
as
the
James
question
was
was.
talking. Well, I was going to ask you something slightly different. Let's put it this: I was going to ask. I mean, we started this discussion with you defending and talking about how proud you are of the record of this government on the environment. And I was asking whether it has delivered on the manifesto project of the most ambitious environment programme of any country on earth. If you are proud of the government's record on the environment, is there not a danger right now that it could get thrown away in the next few months with everything that's going on? And that must be a huge concern to you. And how would that play electorally?
I'd like to say over my dead body. I suppose what I want to say really is that in all of this, all the people in this room, we're all, as you said, we're all converts. We don't need to explain to each other why we understand this stuff and that we understand it. But we do, as you realise when you're in politics and you go to fight, and like, you've got to bring people with you. You know, you've got to get everyone to be on this page. And I think that's what... And I talked about money in people's pockets and affordability and all those things all have to be considered. But for me, protecting and caring for the environment is just so integral to our existence and our futures that it's critical that it's woven into everything we do. But despite some of the things we've heard on the panel, I do think Rishi is a very sensible, deep-thinking person. He's got 2 young daughters who are bending his ear all the time. I genuinely think we've done an awful lot of good under this government. I do wish people would recognise it a bit more because we genuinely, not just the legislation, but look at it, we've got soil on the agenda. I mean, that wasn't on the agenda when I came to Parliament. I did the first ever debate in Parliament on soil. Nobody even mentioned it. Well, now you can be paid to look after it, can't you, as a farmer? You could say they should have been doing that all along, but, you know, that's critical. We banned microbeads in wash-on and care products, and, you know, that wasn't being done before, and the lady's shaking her head, but that was a really big move to get that done. And there's so, we're now looking at wet wipes. There's all the things we're doing on plastics, the ban on single-use, a lot of single-use plastics came out on Sunday. There is an awful lot of good work being done. We need to do more. And I genuinely think it's really important to our electorate. It certainly is in Taunton Dean. But so whether we have to do all those other things too, inflation, get that down, sort out the debt, all of those things. But yeah, if we don't get the environment right, really, in my view, nothing else works.
Okay, Rebecca, thank you very much. Can we please give a round of applause? Thank you for the panel tonight. Thank you very much to Ben Goldsmith, Vicki Hird, to James Murray and Rebecca Powell, of course. Thank you for taking time out. And thank you to the audience in Manchester tonight for joining us as well, and to those watching online as well. Thank you. And I just want to say, give a plug that, of course, to fulfil Charity Commission regulations, we will be doing this again next week in Liverpool at the Labour Party conference, where we'll be asking the question, what is the Labour Party's plan to tackle the nature crisis? And I'm delighted that our panel will include Steve Reed, the Shadow Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. He's only been in the job a few weeks, so we're thrilled that he's joining us. Fiona Harvey, who's of course the award-winning journalist from The Guardian. Joe Bibby, Director of Health at the Health Foundation. And our very own Elliot Chapman-Jones, Head of Public Affairs at the Wildlife Trust. So do join us in Liverpool next Monday if you can. Details on the Wildlife Trust website and social media channels, or do watch on YouTube as it's posted after the event next week. But thank you very much for joining us tonight here in Manchester and online. Good night.